One of the major challenges of conducting animal behavior research is determining which behaviors to observe in order to address your hypothesis. To identify the behaviors that are important to your study, you can create an ethogram. An ethogram is simply a catalog or inventory of behaviors to be observed or studied. It will play an important role in your experimental design and will influence your data collection. This chapter will cover how to identify the behaviors to include in your ethogram based on their relevance to your research question and how to organize and narrow down your ethogram so you can use it in your study. Consult reference materials to learn about the basic biology of the species. Natural history studies will familiarize you with its behavioral repertoire. The Materials and Methods section of journal articles will describe the behaviors that were observed. Find out what questions have already been asked about the species. What kinds of behaviors are most common? When are these animals most active? Does their behavior change seasonally? How do behaviors differ between animals of different ages? How about between the sexes? What kind of courtship rituals do they have? Do males and females participate differently in raising young? Are these animals solitary or social? When you review the literature, note the kinds of behaviors that were observed and measured in earlier studies. You'll look for these behaviors when you conduct your own preliminary observations and pay attention to any behaviors you observe that you didn't read about. Let's return to the example of spectacled bears. A review of the literature reveals that they live in different types of South American forests. They are primarily nocturnal and spend much of their time searching for food, which consists of fruit, vegetation, worms, insects, and rodents. Spectacled bears use strong claws to climb trees and investigate their environment. Like all bears, they have a well-developed sense of smell and communicate important information through scent marking. They are not a highly social species, and with the exception of mothers raising cubs, they are mostly solitary outside of the breeding season. As you read, pay attention to how the behaviors are described and studied. This will help you when you organize your ethogram into categories of behavior. Once you have a handle on the basic behaviors of the species from reading the literature, the next step in developing an ethogram is to conduct preliminary observations. This will give you a chance to observe the behaviors that were described in the literature firsthand. Does what you see match up with the picture of behavior you gleaned from your reading? It may be difficult to tell individuals apart, but for many research questions, you will need an accurate way to identify each animal every time. Most likely, the literature will describe the commonly accepted method for the species you are studying. During your preliminary observations, clearly describe the behaviors you see. For instance, you could describe resting as no movement, eyes open or closed, and pacing as walking back and forth over the same area in a repetitive manner. If the behaviors differ from the descriptions in the literature, you will need to come up with a single definition for a behavior and apply it consistently. During your preliminary observations, also note individual differences in behavior, how the animals spend their time throughout the day, and how they interact with each other. Once you've made a list of typical behaviors based on the literature and your own preliminary observations, you can start to categorize them and decide which ones should be included in your ethogram. Your research question will dictate which behaviors to include. While a behavior may be typical of the species, you can eliminate it if it isn't relevant to your question. In order to generate an ethogram for the spectacled bear example, let's review the research question. Does scent enrichment impact how the bears spend their time and use their space? Because you're interested in their activity budget, your initial ethogram for spectacled bears should be an exhaustive list of the behaviors that fill their time, such as foraging or looking for food, eating what they find, walking around their enclosures, climbing trees or structures, resting or sleeping, investigating the environment, scent marking, social interactions such as aggression, play, and sniffing other bears, and stereotyped or repetitive pacing. Even if a behavior is not prominent in the literature, if you observe it regularly, you should consider including it in your ethogram. Each behavior on your ethogram can be classified as either an event or a state. An event is a discrete behavior that generally, but not always, lasts for a short time. Examples of behavioral events include a wing slap, a song or a call, or a charge. States are activities that are made up of continuous behavior or repeated events. They generally last longer than discrete events and have a definite beginning and end point. Examples of behavioral states include swimming, sitting on the nest, and climbing. In the spectacled bear example, you're interested in the bear's activity budget. Since this should account for 100% of their observation time, you should record the behaviors in the ethogram as states rather than events. Whether your ethogram includes states or events, the behaviors you include should be mutually exclusive. This means that you should always be able to describe your subject as engaged in one and only one state or event. It is always engaged in some behavior, and it is always engaged in only one behavior. Keeping behaviors mutually exclusive can be tricky. For instance, an animal might eat while it walks or vocalize while it flies. Your research question will help you decide how to categorize a behavior. For instance, if your study is concerned with locomotion, you could give locomotor behaviors priority in your ethogram and record locomotion when an animal is observed walking while it eats. Alternatively, if you are interested in feeding behavior, you could record feeding when an animal is observed walking while it eats. If both locomotion and feeding behaviors are important to your study, you might create a third category of behavior, walking while eating. To keep your ethogram simple, avoid doing this often. If you have difficulty determining whether two behaviors are mutually exclusive, refer back to the descriptions you made for each behavior. If the language you use overlaps between the two, you may need to revise your categories to reduce any confusion about the behavior that might arise later. For instance, you could define hunting as actively searching for and obtaining food, and eating as actively ingesting, chewing, or swallowing food. If a behavior has been described clearly in the literature, you can use this description as long as it is consistent with your observations. Be sure that the definitions for your behavioral categories are clear enough to be understood by other observers so that your data are consistent. Your behavioral definitions should be clear enough that someone else could repeat the entire study independently at a later date and get similar results. Let's return to the spectacled bear example. You generated an exhaustive list of 12 behavioral states. Now you should determine whether every behavior on the list is mutually exclusive. Looking at the list, you notice that aggression, play, and sniffing other bears are all social interactions, and to combine aggression and play to keep the categories mutually exclusive, you should either combine all these categories into one social interaction category or keep them separate and eliminate social interaction as a category. Since your question involves scent and the bear's sense of smell, you decide to eliminate social interaction from the list but retain aggression, play, and sniffing other bears. Now you need to decide whether your behavioral categories are detailed enough to address your research question or if the level of detail is too great. Should you combine similar behaviors into one category? If you split behaviors, you may learn more detailed information about the behavior of your subjects. But the more categories you include, the more cluttered your data sheets will be. Also, some behaviors are so infrequent that by keeping them separate, they won't contribute significantly to the data analysis later. To help you decide whether or not to lump or split behavioral categories, consider how each proposed category relates to your research question. For instance, You could lump or split behaviors such as foraging and eating. For a study that concerns the effects of scent enrichment on activity budget, you'll probably be more interested in how much time the bears spend in foraging and eating activities overall in relation to other behaviors than how much time they actually spend finding food versus eating it. Know from your reading and observations that spectacled bears walk around their environment, but also climb trees to find food and build sleeping platforms. Should you lump these two locomotion activities together, or should you split them? Again, refer back to your research question. Since you're interested in activity and use of space within the exhibit, you'll probably find that you'll get the most information by keeping these two locomotory categories separate. Depending on your research question, you may also want to split certain behaviors into new mutually exclusive categories. Let's look at the category of investigation. Since the spectacled bear question concerns scent enrichment, you might consider breaking investigation into two categories: olfactory investigation, such as sniffing objects, and visual or physical investigation, such as looking at and manipulating objects. Since the research question addresses scent enrichment, splitting olfactory investigation from visual and physical investigation will probably give you more information. Examine each of the behaviors on your list to determine whether to lump it with another behavior or split it into separate behaviors based on your research question. You should end up with a list of behaviors that will be meaningful to your study and practical for data collection. Once you have created your ethogram, stick to it. You may find that you need to make a few minor changes to it before you start collecting the data to test your hypothesis. If you change your ethogram after you've started collecting data, you won't be able to compare new data to old data, and doing so will invalidate your results. Now let's turn to the flamingo example. Let's start by reviewing the question. Is there a difference in time spent on the nest and rates of aggressive behavior between female flamingos that successfully rear chicks and those that do not? From your readings and observations, you know that flamingos nest in colonies and form monogamous pair bonds. They usually produce one chick per brood, and both sexes participate in parental care. Flamingo pairs are highly aggressive toward other colony members during the breeding season, especially in crowded nesting areas. For the flamingo study, you aren't interested in total activity budget, but rather in a much more specific set of behaviors. Therefore, in your flamingo ethogram, you could eliminate all behaviors unrelated to nesting, parenting, and aggression, and focus only on developing these categories. Next, identify the nesting behaviors. Since you're interested in the amount of time spent on the nest versus off the nest, you should treat the nesting behaviors as states rather than events. Don't forget to list any behaviors on the nest that take up a substantial amount of time. Since behaviors on the nest are so important to the flamingo study, you'll probably want to split nesting behaviors into several categories. From your readings and observations, your list of nesting behaviors could include inactive behaviors such as sitting on the nest and bill tucking, and active behaviors such as egg rolling and feeding chicks. Now let's look at aggression. In the bear study, aggressive behaviors were lumped together because aggression is just one of its many activities. However, since aggression is central to the flamingo study, you'll want to identify the different types of aggressive behaviors that are common between flamingos, especially during the breeding season. Because you are interested in rates of aggressive behavior, rather than the total amount of time they spend in aggressive interactions, treat the aggressive behaviors as events rather than states. From the literature and your own observations, you note 3 prominent aggressive behaviors: pecking, wing slapping, and chasing. Your flamingo ethogram now has 7 behaviors. It should be a thorough list of nesting and aggressive activities, but it should exclude behaviors that are irrelevant to your study question. Having a limited number of distinct behaviors in your study will simplify your experimental design and data analysis later. If your list includes too many behaviors to reasonably keep track of, simply lump some behaviors together. In order to ensure that your ethogram is truly exhaustive, you should add 2 categories you may not have thought of: out of view and other behavior. Often your subject will disappear out of view during the designated observation time, and in most cases it's best to assume that you don't know and record the behavior as out of view. Even if your literature search and observations were thorough, during the data collection period you may come across a behavior you've never witnessed before. Create a category from your ethogram called Other Behaviors to account for this. As your study progresses, it is tempting to revise your ethogram, but you shouldn't change it after the data collection phase has begun. The addition of these 2 categories will eliminate the need to do so. At this point, you should be pretty confident of your ethogram. That is, you've observed the animals enough to be sure it includes all behaviors that are relevant to your research question and that you can always account for what the animal is doing. Once you have an ethogram of defined behaviors based on your research question, you're ready to start designing your experiment.